U.S. is the largest consumer, producer, and exporter of corn in the world.
Well, if you're wondering why farmers are so concerned about their farm finances right now, they really just can't catch a break. It's not just because corn prices are below break even for most. It's the fact input prices are so high.
I never thought I was going to lose this much money this fast.
Vast cornfields stretching across America's heartland stand eerily quiet. The familiar rumble of harvest equipment has fallen silent. What should be the busiest season of the year has turned into a waiting game that farmers are losing. While American grain sits locked in storage facility, Canadian shipments are crossing oceans to eager international buyers. This dramatic reversal didn't happen overnight, but when it hit, it reshaped global agriculture forever. Across the Midwest, families who have worked the same soil for generations are watching their seasons slip through their fingers like sand through an hourglass. The crisis started with an unexpected policy decision that sent shockwaves through rural America. When Washington implemented heavy tariffs on Chinese-manufactured shipping containers, the agricultural sector felt the immediate backlash. Transport costs from Gulf Coast ports jumped 25%, adding hundreds of millions to export expenses. Pacific shipping rates skyrocketed to $5,000 per container, double the previous rates, almost instant. What had been a recovering post-pandemic market suddenly became an impossible bottleneck for American farmers. From Iowa to Illinois, farmers watched their profit margins evaporate as transportation costs consumed what little remained of their already thin return. But rising shipping costs were just the beginning of America's trouble. Spring 2025 brought another crushing blow that left agricultural communities reeling. Federal grain inspectors rolled out stricter pesticide residue requirements, hiking testing fees by 40%. Every grain shipment now had to pass more rigorous chemical screenings before clearing for export. Failed inspections meant rejected loads and expensive returns that many farmers simply couldn't afford. Mississippi River barge traffic plummeted below 5-year averages as bottlenecks formed at every check. New Orleans ports became floating parking lots with over 180 vessels waiting for clearance, their cargoes slowly deteriorating in the humid Gulf Coast heat. Every day of delay cost farmers roughly 27 cents per bushel. For producers across the Corn Belt, those losses mounted faster than their operations could handle, forcing many to make impossible choices between paying bills and maintaining their farm. February delivered the knockout punch that would fundamentally alter American agriculture's place in the global market. Mexico, one of America's most reliable grain customers for decades, banned genetically modified corn imports entirely. International feed producers quickly followed suit, adding similar restrictions to their contracts with stunning speed. This caught U.S. agriculture completely off guard, as the industry had built its entire foundation on GMO technology. Over 90% of American corn production relies on genetically modified seed, a statistic that had once represented innovation and efficiency but now became a liability. Practically overnight, American grain disappeared from preferred supplier lists worldwide, leaving farmers who had invested millions in modern farming techniques suddenly obsolete in the eyes of international buyers. While America struggled with these mounting challenges, Canada had been quietly positioning itself for exactly this moment with methodical precision. Their Prairie Trace blockchain system could track every grain shipment from farm to final destination, providing the transparency that modern markets increasingly demanded. Canadian exports came with complete verification, low carbon footprint, chemical transparency, and purity documentation that matched evolving global standards perfectly. Within weeks, Canadian exporters locked in multi-billion-dollar contracts with Japan, South Korea, and European Union buyers. The message to international markets was unmistakable. Reliability had found a new address, and it wasn't south of the border anymore. The impact on American agriculture was nothing short of devastating. Midwest corn prices crashed to $3.45 per bushel, the lowest point in nearly a decade and well below what most farmers needed to break even. Meanwhile, Manitoba corn commanded $4.20 per bushel, reflecting the substantial premium international buyers placed on traceability and environmental compliance. The market had spoken with brutal clarity. They would pay more for grain they could trust, and American grain no longer qualified for that trust. Contract cancellations flooded in like a tsunami. Midwest agricultural cooperatives saw agreements terminated outright, often with little notice or explanation. Barges sat anchored with nowhere to go, their crews waiting indefinitely for buyers who never called. Storage silos overflowed while buyers looked north without hesitation, abandoning relationships that had lasted generations. American grain stockpiles swelled to 6-year highs as the crisis deepened throughout the growing season. USDA projections showed 2.5 billion bushels, roughly 68 million tons, would remain unsold by year's end, representing the largest surplus in modern agricultural history. In Cedar Rapids, corn traded at $3.74 per bushel, well below the $4.15 break-even point for most producers and far short of the $4.50 needed to generate sustainable profit. With input costs averaging $165 per acre and climbing, many farmers made the painful decision to halt harvesting entirely, leaving perfectly good grain to rot in the field. Equipment went up for sale at auction houses across the Midwest. Farmers took evening jobs at local factories and retail stores to meet mortgage payments. Indiana's rural economy contracted over 6% in the first quarter alone, the steepest decline since the farm crisis of the 1980s. The crisis extended far beyond individual farms, rippling through entire rural communities like a destructive wave. Food banks faced unprecedented demand as families who once fed the nation found themselves seeking assistance for the first time in their lives. Indiana's food bank system warned that 130 million meals for low-income households were at risk as both funding and surplus grain programs dried up simultaneously. The ethanol industry, a crucial outlet for surplus corn that had provided stability for decades, buckled under the combined pressure of reduced demand and oversupply. Midwest production dropped to 88% capacity as plant after plant shut down operation. 25 plants went idle, eliminating over 1 billion gallons of output and hundreds of jobs in communities where the ethanol plant was often the largest employer. Throughout America's struggle, Canada methodically built its competitive edge with the patience and precision of a chess master. Every shipment leaving Canadian ports reinforced their new market position and demonstrated their commitment to quality and transparency. Canadian grain traveled with complete documentation, origin verification, chemical profiles, and low-carbon certifications that told a story buyers wanted to share with their customers. This wasn't just agriculture. It was sophisticated marketing that positioned Canadian grain as premium product worthy of higher price. Old crop prices in Ontario rose $1.87 above Chicago futures, while new crop sales commanded 18% premiums or higher. Asian and European buyers consistently signaled their willingness to pay for confidence, and Canada delivered that confidence in every ship. Canada sealed their market dominance with smart policy moves that demonstrated government support for agricultural excellence. A March 2025 organic equivalency agreement with South Korea allowed certified Canadian grain to bypass additional port inspections, streamlining the export process and reducing costs. Ontario cooperatives quickly secured 5-year supply contracts worth billions of dollars. Saskatchewan followed with new agreements in Japan and the Netherlands, leveraging both favorable exchange rates and America's growing tariff complications to their advantage. Canadian institutions supported the transition with targeted incentives that made their exports even more attractive. Export Development Canada offered insurance for specialized shipment and covered costs for low-emission transport methods. Rail networks were optimized to move prairie grain efficiently to Vancouver Port, while some lines even offered discounted rates for U.S. cargo on return trips from Asian markets, adding insult to injury for American producers. This fundamental shift extends well beyond corn, threatening to reshape American agriculture entirely. Soybeans face similar vulnerability. Over 90% of U.S. soybean production uses genetically modified varieties, and European buyers are already excluding these crops from their low-carbon supplier list. The effects will cascade through dairy and beef sectors, where feed sourcing preferences will determine which producers remain competitive in an increasingly demanding global market. Australia and Canada are already pledging net zero beef production by 2030, positioning themselves to capture market share before America can adapt to these new environmental standards. Washington faces a critical choice that will determine the future of American agriculture. One option involves comprehensive reform, eliminating punitive tariffs that harm American exporters, providing green farming incentives that help producers meet international standards, implementing national traceability standards that restore buyer confidence, and rebuilding credibility with international buyers through consistent policy and reliable supply chain. This path requires immediate political action and significant investment, but it represents the only viable route to stabilize a collapsing agricultural sector. The alternative maintains the status quo: high trade barriers that isolate American producers, outdated inspection systems that slow export, and subsidies that can't bridge the growing gap between production costs and market price. The transformation of global grain markets happened faster than most experts predicted, catching American agriculture completely unprepared for the new reality. While American farmers watched helplessly as their traditional advantages evaporated, Canada positioned itself as the reliable, forward-thinking supplier that modern markets demand. The question now isn't whether American agriculture can return to its former dominance. That era has likely passed forever. Instead, the question is whether policymakers will act quickly enough to prevent further erosion of the nation's agricultural foundation and salvage what remains of America's position in global food market. The world has moved on. Buyers have found new suppliers, and trust once lost is extraordinarily difficult to regain. The only question remaining is whether America will catch up before it's too late.